Good day and welcome to another edition of Crapper. Today I'm going to be talking about Graaf Generator and their 1975 album Godbluff. What can one say about Graaf Generator? It's sort of difficult to describe them in words, I would say, which is a shame because I shall be using a lot of words over the next few minutes. I sometimes think they're like a band from an alternative universe. Like, imagine if the whole genealogy of the history of rock was different. Like, they might be a sort of like a decisive band, but in a different universe. Not this one, but I think that says something about them. It speaks to their singularity as a unit, right? I should say, perhaps I'm not the biggest Graaf Generator fan. I mean, I've met Graaf Generator fans in my life, and they are the real deal. But I do appreciate a lot of what they do, and I think the trilogy of albums they did in the mid '70s, I think, are really great. And the first one in particular, Godbluff, is Godbluff still life and world record, and the first one, Godbluff, is for my money, it's the best. I think it's the best album they ever did. Because before that they had four other albums from about '68 through to '71. Aerosol Grey Machine. Let's see. The least we can do is wave to each other. H2HE, Who I'm the Only One, and Porn Hearts. And those albums are sort of perhaps almost better remembered, but I think that they're sort of still finding their way at that point. And the lead singer and main songwriter Peter Hamill left after Porn Hearts and started did various solo records, and then came back to Graaf Generator in, as I say, in '75. And I think that there might be a reason for that. I think that perhaps he felt that it was the moment for Graaf Generator to finally nail down their sound, and I think they really did it. I sometimes think of them as being a bit like heavy metal, but without guitars. And I think that one of the interesting resonances here is that Bruce Dickinson, the singer with Iron Maiden, has clearly been very influenced by Graaf Generator. He's mentioned it on more than one occasion, and he did a long song, like a sort of 17, 18-minute epic, at the end of their album Book of Souls, and the track is called Empire of the Clouds. It's a sort of long suite, and that song is clearly influenced by Van der Graaf's sidelong epic A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers at the end of Porn Hearts, right? And sometimes I have the feeling, when I've listened to that Iron Maiden track, I sometimes have the feeling that I'm listening to Graaf Generator. But anyway, so yeah, this is the intensity of heavy metal here, but without the distorted guitars. They have a very unusual lineup. I remember people sort of getting excited about Keane. You remember the band Keane at the beginning of the 21st century? They've got three members. They're mixing it all up. Three members. One of them's a singer. One of them's a drummer. All the harmony comes from the keyboards. How exciting! And then White Stripes. It's only two of them. Well, as it were, the original unusual lineup is Graaf Generator. They don't basically have guitars. Peter Hamill plays a little bit of guitar here and there, but it's not a key instrument. And they also basically don't have bass. They had a bass player on the first couple of albums, but he left. Nick Potter, I think his name was. After he left, the keyboard player Hugh Banton started playing the bass parts on keyboard pedals, basically. So it's a very unusual sort of sound mix that they've got, this band. Now, as I say, we've got Peter Hamill on voice, Hugh Banton on keyboards, and then we've got David Jackson on woodwind. Right, so sax and flute, essentially. And then we have the drummer, Guy Evans, brilliant drummer, absolutely brilliant, master of the art. And I think that what's interesting is if you ever see Van der Graaf live or see clips of them playing live, they have let's say, they sort of alternate between David Jackson and Peter Hamill. So they've got like two breathy, sort of humanistic moments, which are played out over a harmonic bed that comes from the keyboard. You know, Hugh Banton's keyboard, right? So that's like an interesting kind of alternation. Are they prog rock? I mean, I think it might be easier to sort of think of them as art rock, perhaps, because they don't use many of the normal prog rock tropes, what we know as the normal prog rock tropes, which I tend to think of as a British thing, really, if I'm honest. And I think there's something sort of irreducibly continental about Van der Graaf Generator. I sometimes they're very English, but in their sort of like in the vocalizations and things like that sound very English. They look English, you know. But I sometimes feel that they could be an honorary German band, an honorary krautrock band, you know. They also have a sort of Weimar Republic kind of twang. Some of the music almost sounds like Brecht Weill, right? And of course there's existential themes, lyrical themes, which are obviously very continental. I mean, the title of the album, Godbluff, is an existential title, isn't it? You know, no question. So yeah, we've talked about a little bit about their discography. They started in the early days almost like a slightly psychedelic band. They sometimes remind me of early Bowie on the Aerosol Grey Machine, or maybe The Least We Can Do Is Wave to, you know, more on the first album, I think. But they definitely come from a sort of almost Bowie-ish, Pink Floyd-ish kind of angle. So it's a bit more hippie-ish in the early days. There's none of that left by the time they get to Godbluff, you know. You know, it's darker, you know, later, to paraphrase Nick Drake. Yeah, Godbluff, as I said, is my favourite album by them, I think. It's difficult to imagine a darker and more intense album than this, really. I sometimes sort of feel like it's a bit like a nervous breakdown set to music. You know? It's not easy listening, you know. The cover, let's say a word on the cover. It's black. There we go again. One of my deep analyses of the covers. I mean, all the covers from this period have a black kind of setting, but this one's actually just straight black, and then in the corner is stamped diagonally Godbluff, and it's almost like it's stamped in red, almost like this is like a product being exported or something like that. So there's a sort of reference to commodification here. I think this is another Brechtian, thematic, and this, of course, echoes, I think, the alienation of the main character of their music, which is, namely, you know, the Byronic figure of Peter Hamill. And the album cover also has a new logo on it, which they used from then on, which is inspired by Escher. So is it called non-intuitive space? I'm not sure. The lines don't seem to quite. You couldn't make this in real life, you know. These you couldn't make these shapes in real life. Real life, you know what I mean, in 3D. Okay, let's go to tracks. It's 4 tracks, 2 per side. It seems to me to be programmed pretty well, this album. I can't really think of an improvement. Now, track 1 is called The Undercover Man. This is an interesting, enigmatic title, which we'll analyse in more depth in a minute. I just want to talk about the music a little bit. Starts with a whisper. It just sounds a bit like Laurie Anderson when I do it like that. But it's sort of whispering reed instruments, right? And then Hamill comes in and starts whispering over the top. Here, he says. Why is he whispering? Why are they all whispering? Well, because he's the undercover man, of course, right? Again, we'll come back to that in a second. at this point, the reed's split into two parts in the stereo, which corresponds to a time change. It goes from 3/4 to 6/4, I think. And then they use the basic pulse of the 6/4 to move into simple time. So by the time the song comes in, it's in simple time, and so there's a transition there, which again they use these sort of atomic elements in order to do different things over the top, to count it differently over the top. We'll come back to that in a second because it comes up again. They come in when the whole band comes in. They come in on a sort of chorus line, "You and the Undercover Man," right, which almost sounds Pink Floydy to me. Then they go into a sort of bridge sequence, and that's got "I will let da 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 da." That's in a major key. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. It's got a really nice compound time singing from Peter Hamill there. That's a really interesting moment, which I wanted to point out. And then there's a sort of culminating section, also in a major key. Da 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 da. This is a sort of quasi chorus, really. And then they go into a sort of post-chorus sequence, which ends in a sort of very moving, descending chord sequence. Da 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 da, da 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 da, da 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 da. Which almost sounds Beatlesy to me, like almost like George Harrison-y. Then the time signature is suspended, and then you go into a sort of another major key section, which almost serves as like a middle eight. So and then suddenly they stop and they go back to the not the very beginning. They go back to the Undercover Man bit, which is sort of the second bit in the track. It kind of crashes in because it's in a different, because they've ended up in a completely different key at this point, but they kind of crash in with the original key. And that's quite satisfying to hear that, because then you feel like there's some structure here, because at a certain point you feel like this sequence is never going to end, but the developments might go on forever. So you feel sort of like reorientated at this point. And then the whole sequence they go through the whole sequence again, really, with a few variations, including one absolutely amazing drum fill, jazzy drum fill by the brilliant Guy Evans, and also another variation is there's a harmony vocal over the culminating section, which is one of the weirdest harmony vocals I've ever heard. It's got nothing to do with the original line, but that's Hamill, I suppose. Again, he's sort of doing the split subjectivity thing, I think, him and the Undercover Man, who is also him, if you see what I mean. And then they end with a sort of instrumental version, again, of the descending chord sequence with an added sax part, which is extremely moving. This is the first point on the album where I get proper goosebumps. I mean, actually, it's not entirely instrumental, that bit, because there's some vocals buried in it somewhere, right? And you're not quite sure what he's saying entirely. And so the idea there is that, of course, it's like he's buried, right? Buried alive. So that makes me think that maybe an inspiration for the lyrics to this song is The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, which is about the theme of sort of being buried alive, and more distantly Antigone, the Greek heroine, who's buried alive for breaking the law, basically, by burying her brother who's betrayed the state. But yeah, so is this song about being buried alive? Well, look, there's a line in it early on where he says, "My constant friend, ever close at hand, you and the Undercover Man." So it's me, you, and the Undercover Man. You think, oh, there's three people? But no, I think it's actually two, because I think he's the Undercover Man. And he's also himself, so he's doubled, right? And this thing of being the Undercover Man, I think, is related to the theme of being buried alive, basically due to his anxiety. It's his anxiety that's burying him alive. That's why he can't breathe, because anxiety is to do with breathing, right? And he says, let the madness be who I am. So anxiety is related to madness, right? So yeah, that's why he can't breathe, basically. And that's hence the opening, the breathy opening. Anyway, that's just a theory. Who knows? Who knows? Let's move on to track 2. Side 1, track 2, Scorched Earth. Right. This track is a very riffy track. Starts with a classic Graaf Generator riff. Again, heavy metal without guitars. And that kind of builds up. The band comes in, and then they do a verse sequence, a double verse sequence in a sort of rumba rhythm. Dun 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 dun. And then they go into it stops and they go into a quiet contrasting section. Very sort of atonal licks in this one. Then they go back to the beginning riff, the opening riff, and then they introduce a sort of variation riff, which becomes more important as the song goes on. Then they go into a sort of aggressive, like instrumental version of the quiet contrasting section that I mentioned earlier, with perhaps the most complicated time signature I've ever heard in my life. And then everything stops again, and they have these ascending semitone leaps. Da, 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 da. So the time signature is totally suspended here. And then there's a little linking passage, and then they go back to the verse. And there's a kind of sense of relief at that point for the listener. And then they go back to the riff, which was the variation on the opening riff, and they do that basically to the end, although there's some interesting keyboard variations. It's almost symphonic, this ending. It's quite difficult on this track. It's quite difficult to imagine. It's quite difficult to believe that 4 people can make this much sound, It's extremely exciting, the ending to this track, I think. So for me, this is another goosebump moment. And the lyrics, by the way, of Scorched Earth are about a general who basically has to keep fighting or he dies, right? Hence, Scorched Earth. It seems to be based on like the Crusades or the 100 Years' War or something like that. I also think there might be an allusion here to the Nietzschean Superman, is sort of as an ethical exemplar, somebody who basically relies on their own resources, and isn't sort of waiting for the other person to kind of like justify their own existence, basically. Okay, side 2 begins with a track called Arrow, which I think is my favourite track on the album. I think this is a stone cold Van der Graaf classic, this one. It's really intense, this track, but it's so exciting. I feel like anybody would like this track. You don't have, as I said before, you don't have to be a Van der Graaf fan to kind of appreciate how great this track is, I think. But I mean, that's just me. I'm just speaking for myself. This is a simpler structure this time. It slightly reminds me of Pigs, 3 Different Ones by Pink Floyd. It's introduction, and a verse chorus, second verse chorus, instrumental bit, third verse chorus, instrumental ending, right? So it's more dramatically clear, this track. Maybe that's why it works so well. I mean, I think a heavy metal band could have quite happily covered this number. And I also think that because they used the famous Iron Maiden chords in the chorus. Plus, Hamill's distorting his voice a lot here, So again, it almost sounds like proto-death metal, some of this. And by the way, his voice is absolutely incredible. Arrow, that ending bit. The last time he sings that is so exciting for me. I love it. The lyrics this time are about a manhunt, it seems. Possibly against the background of a religious war. Maybe the English Civil War, who knows? They don't bother to make it clear. But no need. And let's go then to the final track, the Sleepwalkers, track side 2, track 2. Cannot work out what this opening time signature is at all. I'm not actually singing the notes there, it's too complicated. But yeah, I tried to work out the time signature, I couldn't do it. The best I could do is it's bar of 6, bar of 3, bar of 7, bar of 2. I mean, bearing in mind that most popular music is in bars of 4, you can see how unexpected all of that is. I think what they're basically doing is like separating out, as I mentioned before, they're separating out the sort of quavers, are they called, like the sort of atomic units, the sort of notes really, and they're suspending the higher level counting, so it's not completely clear how many how many beats each bar has in it, but in any case, it basically has a flowing sort of 6/8 feel, this number. So yeah, it begins with this sax riff in this weird time signature, which develops and repeats 3 times. It keeps going and going and going, this. And then it goes into a sort of circusy riff, but ultimately could be a heavy metal riff. Or well, Wagnerian, really, actually. As a lot of heavy metal is. Which then develops a little bit, and then they do a parody of it, almost like they're playing cinema hall music. They're actually suspiciously good at playing cinema hall style music, but let's not go into that. And then they go into another heavy rock variation. Then briefly they go back to the beginning again. You can see we've got another complicated structure coming up here, and then they stop again, and then they finally go into a sort of strident, joyous section in the slow 4 time. I mean, this is really the apotheosis, or one of the apotheoses of this track, I should say. I'd search the hidden corners of all this world. I've forgotten the tune, but yeah. Make reason of the sensory world if I only had time. I sang that completely wrong, but it's something like that. Oh, I'd search the hidden corners of all this world, make reason of the sensory world if I only had time, but soon the dream is ended, right? So this is the sort of like culminating idea, I would say. And then they go into a sort of atmospheric passage where they just alternate between 2 chords in a suspended time signature. And then a heavy riff crashes in a common time. Sort of walking pace. I suppose you'd call it 120 BPM. I think that's what they call walking pace. Might be a metaphor, that, but I think it's probably close enough. And this riff is... That's repeated almost ad nauseam, although it does develop a bit at the end. Again, it's sort of cross rhythms, so it's very kind of like sort of jarring, really, but like that's the idea. That's why it's exciting. And then there's a release because it goes into the vocals come back and it goes into an extremely exciting vocal passage. Tonight before you lay down, he's giving final, sort of restitution to the listener. When you lay down, you have your dream, because this is about a dream. I'll come back to that in a second. And yeah, drums sound amazing on this passage. And yeah, so it's got these sort of culminating chords. Again, the Iron Maiden chords, really. D, C, A sharp. And it's very exciting, very moving, this culminating passage. Hamill's practically screaming at this point. So again, this is another Goosebumps moment. We should have a little icon for Goosebumps. Then they need to wrap up somehow. So quickly they go back to the start and they reprise a first set of variations. Then they reprise a second set of variations, which is the strident bit, basically, comes back in. I mean, this bit is Beethovenian, actually. I'm throwing in all the references tonight. It's like, it reminds me, it's almost like the ending of, the beginning of the 4th movement of Beethoven's 5th Symphony. Or the 9th Symphony, why not? And then they stop and they close on a reprise of the atmospheric section, the two chords, alternating between the two chords, and then it fades out, right? Now, lyrically, I think this is the most metaphysical song. As I said, it's about dreams, right? The fact that it's metaphysical shows that they're not entirely an English style band, this band, that they're more European, because basically the English don't do metaphysics, right? That's been long established. It's also Freudian, clearly, because, you know, Freud says in The Interpretation of Dreams that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, and that's what this is about, this song. So in a sense, we've sort of gone full circle here, because we're back to the split subjectivity of the Undercover Man, I would say. But of course, it's an anxiety dream, this, so it's perhaps more Wes Craven than Sigmund Freud. I mean, we're on Nightmare on Elm Street territory here, you know, Wes Craven's masterpiece, in my opinion. Anyway, that's perhaps all I've got to say on the details of the album. This is so great, this album. And as I say, you don't have to be a Van der Graaf, the biggest Van der Graaf fan to love it, you know. And it's just, I think it's the highest example of their art form, Godbluff. That's why I would recommend it above Porn Hearts or any, you know, or H2HE, which is always discussed as their poppy album, which it definitely isn't. But it just is some things about H2HE, the third album, which are kind of a bit more amenable, is that the word, to the listener. By this point, it's all intense darkness. You know, darkness has descended by this point. But I just think it works more fully as an artistic form, what they're doing at this point. So, yeah, I would recommend it without reservation. And that's all for today. I'll see you on the next crapper. And thanks very much for your attention. Ta-ra.